Hello, everyone. This is Professor Segrist, and this is a lesson on Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War. So, first, a couple of words on Thucydides. Um, he's generally considered the first great historian in the modern sense of the term, um, focusing on strictly observable facts. Um, Bringing in no assumptions or speculations about extra human forces, what the gods might be doing. Herodotus certainly has a claim to being a great historian, is a historian of the Persian Wars. He often brought in um, omens and various claims of what the gods might have been up to, and Thucydides leaves all of that out. He also has a claim to be a great political philosopher because he considers the fundamental questions of human experience. Really, you can see his analysis and his interpretation as, in many ways, a reflection on the nature of human life, human nature, and so forth. A second uh, point about Thucydides is that he's an Athenian, and he was personally an actor in the events he describes. He makes two personal appearances in the book. Uh, First, he reveals at some point that he's a general, an Athenian general in exile. He had been exiled because he lost battle, a significant battle, and it wasn't uncommon for generals to be exiled for that reason. And partly because perhaps they thought the gods had abandoned that person or whatever. Certainly, as um, a factor in people's decision making, those kind of beliefs were relevant, and so um, you know empirically worth bringing up. Um, but so that was one case. The other case was he was a victim of the plague in Athens. Um, the there was a point where the Athenians had withdrawn within the city walls, behind the long walls connecting the city to the port of Piraeus, and a plague broke out in those closed conditions, and he contracted the plague, and he describes it. It's kind of an empirical masterpiece of description. But he also describes the social effects of the plague. People were, much like you've heard about some perhaps stories about the Black Death in Europe. Um, People sort of, a lot of people taking the attitude that we might as well eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. And he describes a shocking moral breakdown in Athens. Every man for himself kind of situation. So cruelty, but also moral depravity of various kinds. Um, the uh, the other thing I would bring out about Thucydides as a historical actor it, is that it relates to his ability as a historian. I mean, first of all, he has firsthand experience of events. Uh, he witnessed a lot of things. He was in contact with a lot of people who witnessed a lot of things, and and so that gave him, a sort of empirical grasp of things going on. But at the same time, he had a certain detachment. Um, uh, lending to an objective analysis because he was exile, um, perhaps because of his personal integrity, because of a certain humility. I mean, bear in mind that, spoiler alert if you didn't know this, but um, Athens loses the war, loses this conflict ultimately to Sparta, and so he's writing from the losing side. But he manages to be very even-handed in his treatment of the Athenians and the Spartans and the various allies. Um, it wouldn't be obvious that he was Athenian if you didn't know it, just on reading the book. Um, this is an interesting case of, that you've heard the comment often made that the victors write the history. Well, not in this case. And some of the great histories are, in fact, written by the losers. The histories that stand the test of time, that hold up, are sometimes by the losers. Excuse me. I'll see how my throat holds up. I have a bit of a sore throat. Hopefully, I won't totally break down. That on Thucydides, on the book. There's first some comments on the book, the work in general. The Peloponnesian War it's not an original title. As far as I know, there was not a title given to the work by Thucydides. And in some respects, it's misleading. The Peloponnesian War was not one war. It was a 30-year period where there were several wars, alternating between periods of relative peace. You could call the times of peace a Cold War. So there were periods of hot war and Cold War. But it's excuse me. Thucydides is interested in more than just the battle. Early in his introductory comments, he uses the term kinesis in the Greek. If you're military or have any experience of read much about military affairs, you've heard the term kinetic, meaning activity, right? And this may not be completely obvious from the English translation, but Thucydides calls this 30-year event a kinesis, a great movement, a movement that he thinks has world historic significance. He thinks this is the greatest movement the world has ever seen in terms of scale, in terms of significance. From the Greek perspective, it was a world war. He took the whole Greek world was involved and shaken up by it. But he's interested in this not merely from a military perspective, but from a perspective of the human factors, the human causes of the conflict, the effects of the conflict, the human effects, the fighting itself, was plenty traumatic, but the effects extended far beyond the battlefield. Back home on the domestic front, things are breaking down, moral breakdown, social breakdown generally. There's a great analogy in literature with Homer, right? Homer, the Iliad, they're off for 10 years. All these leaders of the various city-states, Greek city-states, Achaeans they called them then. Their way at war for 10 years, and meanwhile back home, people like Penelope, which you see in the Odyssey, are trying to hold things together and having a tough time of it. Something to bear in mind about war. It always has collateral effects um, in domestic affairs as well as international power relations and so forth. Um, and then, in terms of the ultimate aim of his book, Thucydides suggests that um, he's looking for timeless lessons. He thinks this has timeless lessons uh, for us, and I think that's because he's looking for an understanding of human nature and the causes and effects of human action in general, not just in this particular conflict. He thinks this reveals humanity. This extraordinary world historic event reveals humanity in a way that nothing else has. Um, so those points in terms of the work in general. Um, some highlights of Thucydides' account. First of all, the context. Um, the, uh, the Greek city-states have recently fended off the Persians. Persian wars are not far in the background. And in the aftermath of the Persian Wars, Sparta, as they tended to do, sort of withdrew back into their region on the Peloponnesus. They had to had to be constantly worry about a revolt of their massive slave population. So they tended to be inwardly focused on home affairs. But Athens became an imperial power. It was the head of the Delian League, that defensive alliance formed by city-states around Greece, and it started throwing its weight around. It started playing hardball with a lot of the other city-states, demanding, uh, tribute. Pericles used a lot of this money that Athens was getting when they took over the treasury at Delos, the islands the Delian League is made out of, named after, um, to build up the Parthenon and all of the spectacular um, Greek architecture in Athens. And the turning of the screws and the way Athens treated a lot of the other city-states um, were unsettling, and the rise of Athenian power was unsettling in and of itself. People worried that Athens was becoming so powerful that they could pretty much do whatever they wanted um, to other city-states. And this was, we may touch on this later, this was, Thucydides thought, a major causal factor in the war. The threat of growing Athenian power as perceived by the other city-states, and including, most importantly, Sparta, because Sparta was the primary counterweight, the primary player. They, after all, had been part of defeating the Persians as well as Athens. So that's the context. There are a lot of different dynamics that Thucydides considers as he tries to interpret this conflict. Dynamics of power and interest, of different cultures, of different regime types, of individual charisma, rhetoric, and decision making, of arguments about justice and interest, among other things. It's really a holistic approach. I mean, he's trying to consider this spectacular human phenomenon from every angle, and it's the opposite of a reductionist treatment. I mean, so like Thucydides might um, criticize modern political analysis for being too narrow in its interpretations, taking one paradigm or lens or whatever uh, interpretive lens for understanding um, major events, and he does very much the opposite of that. Um, so more on that later when we look at the value of the book uh, for political theory. Um, the other thing I'll say about the highlights of the book are related to Athens and Sparta. I mean, they're the central foci uh, of the book. They're the central players in the conflict, um, and and so uh, and I'll consider this in relation to the dynamics I just mentioned that Thucydides focuses on. In terms of power dynamics, I mean, I just mentioned the fact that Thucydides thought the use of power, perceptions about power, were um, a key cause of the conflict. Cultural dynamics. Athens and Sparta were very different culturally, and the cultural differences Thucydides thought played a major role in the way they thought about things, the way they acted. Athens uh, was a very open, commercial society, very creative and enterprising in their orientation, freewheeling, both at home and abroad, willing to experiment, try new things, and so forth. Sparta was a closed society. It was all the city-states were pretty much slave societies in the sense that they relied on slave labor for certain things. But Sparta was, I mean, we have a massive slave population, far out numbering the non-slave population, the helots, they're called. Uh, and um, and so they were very much inwardly focused, as I mentioned before. Um, Tradition-bound society. I mean, there were things that we might look at as progressive. That women were very involved in public life in Sparta, and actually weren't in Athens. Very much the opposite in Athens. But generally speaking, they were very much not uh, interested in social experimentation and trying new things. Um, they were also a heavily militarized society, partly to deal with the slaves, um, partly just the sort of culture, the warrior mentality. The whole society was geared towards war. Young boys were taken to train at a young age, taken away from their families to have rigorous training for war. Athens didn't do that at all. It was more like us in a lot of ways. A lot of these ways, more like us in the U.S. In fact, during the Cold War, um, military historians often would compare, other historians as well, compare the Athenian Sparta contrast to the U.S. Soviet. Um, there's obvious ways that Sparta is very different from the Soviet Union, but there are some ways that, in terms of general outlook um, and cultural outlook, that they're pretty similar. Another dynamic, contrasting regime types. I mean, Athens was a democracy, a direct democracy. Um, Sparta was a mixed regime. There were democratic elements in it, but you could certainly say, especially because of the sort of plantation-based, we might get the later term use slave society, um, were oligarchically inclined. Certainly, it was an oligarchy of slave owners to slaves, um, but had a lot of oligarchic dynamics in the way they operated. Um, in terms of key individual players, one of the interesting things about Thucydides' analysis, and it's very revealing, is that he often considers um, important individual players in pairs. Excuse me. Pausanias and Themistocles, Nicias, and Alcibiades. Um, they are characters that do things in very different ways, and by pitting them side by side against each other, Thucydides can show the sort of pluses and minuses of their approaches. Um, one just special note I would point out is Thucydides, in terms of individual players, Thucydides' apparent special admiration for Pericles as a political leader and as a strategist. So you might pay special attention to that and think about why. I mean, it may be revealing about Thucydides' larger perspective on how things work and um, in war and peace and political relations. Um, Finally, the last dynamic I'd mentioned in relation to Athens and Sparta were their justifications for their actions. Everybody made justifications, arguments for what they were doing, um, and which may reveal something, by the way, about human nature. We always feel the need to justify. Why is that? Even tyrants feel the need to, put a spin on what they're doing. Um, but Athens typically, in Thucydides' account, this shows his objectivity, defended its actions in terms of raw interest. Um, this is good for us, and screw you. Uh, um, it's not always the case. I mean, in Pericles' funeral oration, you get more of a something like a defense from a more high-minded perspective. The Athenian way of life is a good way of life, and worth defending and promoting and so forth. But you can contrast Pericles' funeral oration to the Melian dialogue, which I'll talk about in a second, which is really a very raw statement of self-interest by the Athenians. Sparta and its allies typically defended its actions in terms of justice. They said, we're fighting against Athenian tyranny, tyranny over not at home but over the other city-states. There are obvious Spartan interests at play. Thucydides may take their claims of justice with some grain of salt, but he may also admire that. I mean, I think he does seem to admire that in some respects, and does seem to think that there may be some, at least some, genuine commitment to ideas of justice in a way that, by Sparta and its allies, in a way that Athens was simply not truly committed to. I'll mention three illustrative episodes that are most famous, perhaps the most famous ones in Thucydides' work, and that are especially revealing in some ways. First on the Pericles' funeral oration. It's a really striking account and celebration of Athenian culture and the Athenian way of life. And I think you can see in that funeral oration a lot of us. I mean, it's the way he presents Athens and the way Athenians see themselves is very much the way Americans see themselves. Um, so the so that's really worth reflecting on, I think, um, and for that cultural um, aspect. The Athenian plague is, I think, worth contemplating as well, and how it shows the fragility of moral order, um, how easily moral order can break down completely um, in in desperate circumstances, and also perhaps that it shows a weakness in Athenian moral character. I mean, it's conceivable that someone could face those kind of situations with more dignity and um, you know less every man for himself kind of approach, but they don't. And Socrates later will be very critical of Athenian moral culture and what he sees as a moral decline. We'll talk about that momentarily too. Um, and then the last illustrative episode I'd point to is the Melian dialogue, um, which is a favorite illustration of realist IR assumptions. That everything sort of boils down to dynamics of power and interest. That's really what to pay attention to. That's really what ultimately is driving uh, political players um, more than anything else. And the famous quote in the Athenian negotiators who are pressing um, the Melians from the island of Melos to, I can't remember if it was an island or just a city-state on the coast, but pressuring them to submit to Athenian demands, um, to ally themselves with Athens as opposed to remaining neutral, which is what they wanted to do in the conflict. Um, the line was, the strong do what they will, the weak do what they must. Um, that's hardcore uh, interest-based thinking, and Thucydides pulls no punches in just presenting it, uh, with 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 no polishing away the hard edges. So those illustrative episodes I'd single out as the most famous and perhaps especially worth thinking about. Um, One last comment on um, the work uh, is the aftermath of the conflict. I mean, we don't see it. He doesn't actually finish the work. We don't actually see Thucydides' analysis of the end of the conflict, but we know what happens. We know that Athens loses the war, ultimately the conflict, and we can sort of see things moving in that direction in his analysis. Athens is making a lot of blunders, most significantly sort of going off course and trying to seize Syracuse over in Sicily. Seems like a foolhardy mission in terms of what they really need. Big power play. And Alcibiades is the key figure there. Alcibiades and Nicias, as I mentioned. Alcibiades, interestingly, was one of Socrates' disciple isn't the right word, but one of these young men who followed Socrates around and listened to his arguments and dialogues with other people, and you could make a case that Athens lost the war because of Alcibiades in particular. That he and it was because, I mean, Thucydides presents it as because Alcibiades was an unscrupulous figure. He would do anything for fame and power. He was very charismatic, and he very good at persuading people, moving people by his speeches and so forth. Very eloquent, but fundamentally um, without a moral compass. And this played into the um, perception among a lot of Athenians that Socrates was a corrupter of the youth. That was one of the charges against him in Socrates' trial. Um, Socrates, of course, uh, Plato suggests Xenophon, you know, a man of action, but an admirer of Socrates, also suggests uh, that this is ridiculous. That Socrates, uh, if anything, had did more than anyone else to try to influence Alcibiades to, to examine himself and clean up his act and so forth. But this association, the fact that Alcibiades had always been hanging around Socrates back in Athens, um, you know, uh, gave him um, bad PR, I guess you could say. Um, but ultimately, I think you could say that the biggest outcome, most lasting outcome of the conflict was the emergence of Greek philosophy and ultimately Western civilization. And uh, the Plato's dialogues of Socrates, um, the primary focus of the dialogue is really implicitly a moral critique of Athens and of prevailing views of the day. And the context again is that social order has broken down. I mean, Athens is um, a shell of their former greatness, I suppose, certainly from a moral perspective of what they were after the war. Um, of course, they're being controlled by outside powers much of the time, the 30 Tyrants period and so forth. Um, but Socrates, in all of the dialogues, is trying to cultivate uh, a, a renewed moral order, one person at a time, um, trying to get people to think about what's important in life, um, why justice is better than injustice, why it's worth being committed to, uh, and so on. And then ultimately, Plato and Aristotle provide a searching, powerful philosophical analysis and elaboration of justice and injustice and the human good um, and what life is about, what society should be, what kind of way of life would be best, and so on. And their thought had a massive effect on later Western leaders, Western thinkers, but also even Western leaders who picked up, usually indirectly, a lot of those ideas. Um, and Western civilization, I think, has been described, and I think correctly, as a product of Greek philosophy and Christianity. I mean, and the mainline Christianity adopted the Greeks, adopted Plato and Aristotle as fundamentally simpatico with um, Christian morality, Christian understanding of reality, generally speaking. Um, and so, it, and my point is, in relation to Thucydides' work is all of this was in reaction to this Greek philosophy, in reaction to what they perceived to be a breakdown of moral order in Athens and related moral relativism, skepticism, and so forth. Socrates famously says, I know that I don't know. That's part of his wisdom. What he meant by that was he knows that he doesn't know the answers to the most important questions in life. But precisely because of that, he exercised a certain humility. And but one thing he does claim to know in the Apology is that one should always obey someone better than yourself. He did claim to know fundamentals about what is better and worse, what is good and bad, just and unjust, as sort of indices, sort of a spectrum. Couldn't answer, what is the ultimate meaning of life, what is the ultimate human destination after death, and so forth and so on. This is the irony of Socrates. Many ironies about Socrates that he comes in proclaiming ignorance, and yet his main enemies and targets of his critiques are precisely people who claim there is no truth, we can't know right and wrong, and so forth, as well as those who simplistically claim to be able to teach virtue. Socrates thought many of those people's ideas were themselves corrupt, and they weren't really teaching virtue. They were the corruptors of the youth, and so forth. Anyway, the value of this work for theories of international politics and political theory in general. In terms of international politics theory, you think of the schools of thought. International relations realism. You have a careful analysis of the dynamics of power and interest. Idealism. You have appeals to justice. Constructivism. You have an analysis of cultural dynamics and how important that is. People's beliefs, ideas about how society ought to be, their values, their opinions. And then comparative politics. This comparison of regime types is, again, a central part of his analysis. In terms of political theory generally, Thucydides provides a reflection on the fundamental features of human nature and human behavior in a rather comprehensive way. I mean, he, like Socrates, he doesn't come out and say, okay, well, here's the conclusions. We can say human nature is like this. Here are the principles we could draw out. But it's clearly there's a lot of reflection going on in his judgments and his interpretations. And that's what he was interested in. He was interested in this kinesis, this movement, as a presentation of humanity and something to be studied for the sake of understanding humanity and how human beings operate, and those timeless lessons he wanted to draw. And so I think the two larger important points of value for Thucydides. One is we see an examination. I think this is one good reason to start the course off with this. We see an examination of a vast wealth of empirical data. All of these details of the events going on, which is where to start. I mean, if you're trying to understand political reality, you want to start with what happens, what's going on, what are the events, what are the problems people are trying to tackle practically, and so forth. And then you try to analyze those, develop a criterion of judgment about causes and perhaps qualitative judgments, normative judgments, as I like to call them these days. Um, and the other is the model of objective, careful, comprehensive analysis that Thucydides models. So that's all I have on Thucydides. I'll see you again for the next lecture.